welcome. I think we'll get started. I expect people will be trickling in as one is trickling now. I'm Kate with the Historical Society, so glad to see you. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are filming, so if you could turn phones off so we don't catch that in our recording, that would be great. And the way the evening is going to go, we'll introduce our speaker. I think he's going to give us a wonderful talk, and then we'll have a Q&A opportunity. I'll update with some announcements and news and whatnot, and then we'll have refreshments, and he's indicated he's going to stick around, so that's going to be a treat for us all. So who here has someone that's close to you that's in Arlington Cemetery? Pretty much. Who's been to a service at Arlington Cemetery? Pretty awesome. Who's been married in Arlington Cemetery? Yeah, the only one I know, right? So, very cool. This is a great story, and Tim is going to tell about how we connected with him. So we're really have a treat not only to have his expertise here, but he's grounded in our town, and we met organically at the train show, so that's a good story. I was telling him earlier, I love having speakers come in who are historians and learn about the different ways they apply their expertise and their professional disciplines, because there's just so many ways to get engaged in the history of anything and everything, and particularly will benefit from the Arlington story. So he attended St. Mark's and St. John's College, so local guy. Passion for history. I'm certain your curriculum had a lot of history in it, right? And then went to Catholic and earned a BA. Worked at the National Museum of the United States. Now, I didn't know there was such a thing, so maybe we'll hear a little bit about what that is. Then historian at the cemetery, contributing to a variety of exhibits, including the Medal of Honor exhibit. And then he completed his MA in history from Kansas State. So he's been involved in research, naval history and the Heritage Command, research for them, conducted interviews with active duty personnel and veterans, inquiries from government offices related to questions about history, contributed to the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, and interviewed sailors on a destroyer and aviators on an aircraft carrier. That's pretty awesome. Then he became the historian of Arlington National Cemetery. He oversees research, briefs visiting dignitaries, and works with the tomb guards to preserve institutional knowledge. So welcome, and take it away.
Thanks. So as you just heard, I grew up in the DC area inside the Beltway. I went to St. Mark's Elementary School in Adelphi, Maryland, and when I was there, when I was 10 years old, my grandfather gave me his medals from World War II, and that started a lifelong interest in history, and fortunately my teachers encouraged it. I was checking out books at the library on General Patton, MacArthur, Eisenhower, the Medal of Honor, and I wasn't your average 10-year-old. My teachers thought that I could use some structure, so my parents sent me, at my request, to St. John's High School in DC, and that's where, again, I had really good history teachers, and I ended up at Catholic University studying under one of the Navy historians who worked at the Smithsonian. So I've been kind of living the historian's dream. Two things, all of those years, I would always get people to, who would say, well, good luck finding a job in history. And good luck finding a woman that likes military history. So ever since 1998, except for grad school, I've been working in the historical field. And in 2010, I went to work for the Naval History and Heritage Command. And a few months after I started working there, I turned around in a staff meeting, and there was a young woman sitting a couple rows behind me. She was a museum technician at the National Museum of the United States Navy. It took me about 5 months, but I asked her to an Air Force concert. And about a week later, she emailed me and she said, thanks for taking me to the concert. Would you like to go to Antietam next weekend to see the battlefield? So I thought, should I propose at Bloody Lane or should I wait to get to know her? I ended up waiting to get to know her. A few months later, I proposed, and we now have 4 kids, ages 5, 7, 9, and 11. And so I'm early. In 2015, she's my wiser half. In 2015, the job opened up at Arlington, and so I jumped ship and went over to Arlington, left the Naval History and Heritage Command, because she said, Tim, you've been talking about Arlington for years. Just apply and see what happens. And so I applied, and I got the job. And like I say, I'm just living the historian's dream. Every morning when I cross the Memorial Bridge before the sun comes up, I get halfway across the bridge, and I see a little flicker of light off in the distance under the Arlington House, and it's the eternal flame at President Kennedy's grave. Yeah, and I mean, for the last 10 years, and then I turn into the cemetery, and I say good morning to my 400,000 friends, and I get to tell their stories and the story of the cemetery. So I was, one of the titles that went out was from a pauper cemetery, and I'll kind of give you why I say a pauper cemetery to the premier national cemetery. As you might have heard, Arlington was once the home of Mary Custis Lee and her husband Robert E. Lee. You might have heard of Robert E. Lee. He resigned his commission at the beginning of, before the Civil War started, moved south, and his family followed. And on May 23rd, 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union, and within hours, the United States Army seized the property. And they had already, it was the high ground. Confederate artillery could have hit every federal building within sight. So out of military necessity, they secured the high ground. In 1862, Congress passed legislation that if you lived in the insurrectionary or rebellious areas and you paid your taxes, all is well. And I'm paraphrasing the legislation, but that was the gist of it. The only thing is you had to appear in person to pay your taxes, but Mrs. Lee sent a relative to pay her $92.07 tax bill for the 1,100-acre plantation. Since she could not appear in person, this was 1863, the government put the property went up for auction for failure to pay taxes. And in 1864, the United States government was the only bidder and secured the 1,100 acres at a tax sale. By 1864, the casualties were mounting, and the nearby cemeteries were beginning to fill to capacity. The Soldiers' Home had given some acres to the Army in 1862 to establish a cemetery, and in Alexandria, right nearby, there was also a cemetery established. But by May of 1864, both of those cemeteries were filling up and there was no more room. So the Quartermaster General and the Secretary of the Army looked across the river and saw these 1,100 acres as an ideal place to bury soldiers. On May 13th, 1864, Private William Chrisman was buried in the lower part of the cemetery where, if you can think where the Iwo Jima Memorial is today, on that side of the cemetery, they started a small section, and that's where Private Chrisman was buried. He enlisted, anticipating probably that he would fight. He died of disease in a Washington, D.C. hospital, as many did in the Civil War. 1 month later, on June 15th, 1864, we became a national cemetery. The Secretary of War and Quartermaster General set aside 200 acres of those 1,100 acres in the plantation to be a cemetery. This is one of the earliest photographs, and this we believe is section 27, what today is section 27, on that Iwo Jima side, the Iwo Jima Memorial side of the cemetery. You can see that there's wood headboards, and back then they used wood headboards where they would have the soldier's name. Eventually in 1873, they switched to that iconic marble headstone that you're familiar with today. Now, Montgomery Meigs was the Quartermaster General, and he was not happy that Robert E. Lee resigned his commission, and so he directed, they directed that it become a cemetery. Some people say it was out of spite, but that's only a very small part of the story, because out of military necessity, they really had nowhere else to bury the soldiers. And so you'll see in the top photograph is an old postcard of what's now section 13. It was known as the Field of the Dead, and there are 16,000 plus Civil War soldiers in that section. You walk across the street from the Arlington House, and you're in section 13, and you can see the white marble headstones are pretty much as far as the eye can see. The lower photograph is right next to Mrs. Lee's rose garden. Montgomery Meigs directed that officers be buried surrounding the rose garden. I was at the National Archives one day and I was researching the Quartermaster General's papers, and I found a letter from Montgomery Meigs where he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I directed the men who were at Arlington to bury around the rose garden. And he says, they kind of rebuffed his orders to bury, and probably because they would walk out of the Arlington house and look right over at the rose garden and see those headboards of their comrades. He mentioned that when he discovered the error, he personally went to make sure that they buried around the rose garden near the house. This is another section. This is another image of section 13. And again, you can see headstones as far as the eye can see. Back in those days, if you were buried at Arlington, it indicated that it was an indication that your family could not afford the cost to return your remains home. And it was very expensive to embalm and transport in those days. So in a sense, Arlington in those days and other national cemeteries were pretty much pauper cemeteries for soldiers. It started to change a bit after the Civil War. In 1866, General Meigs directed that all of the remaining, or as many that they could find, the remaining unknown soldiers in the Virginia battlefields be brought back to Arlington. So he sent teams out because the farmers were coming upon the remains of Civil War soldiers. He sent teams out and they brought 2,111 remains back to Arlington. He designed an ossuary, and they placed those 2,111 remains in the ossuary. They covered it up, and then he designed a marker or a monument to commemorate and remember those 2,111. So that's the first real memorial, in a sense, at Arlington. In 1868, everything changed. General John Logan, who was the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. It's a Civil War veterans organization, similar to VFW or American Legion today. They're very powerful. They had a very powerful lobby. He established Decoration Day. And Decoration Day, as we now know, is Memorial Day. And thousands of people showed up to Arlington to decorate the graves with flowers. The first Decoration Day, speeches were held at the Arlington House, and children from the Orphans Asylum marched around the house into the graves of the Civil War unknowns and placed flowers there, and then they went over to this Field of the Dead, which you can see here in this engraving, and they placed flowers on the graves. And so year after year, thousands of people started showing up to Arlington. In 1873, Montgomery Meigs designed a very small amphitheater of wood and brick for the Decoration Day activities. And you can see here, President Ulysses S. Grant attended that ceremony. And so we started seeing presidents showing up to Arlington, elevating that stature of the cemetery. This is a modern day view of that memorial amphitheater. We also started seeing names of the, really the giants of the Civil War. General Sheridan wanted to be buried at Arlington. It's the first recorded funeral that we've been able to find where there was the horse and caisson bringing him to his grave. But his very large private marker is right in front and off to the side of the Arlington House. So when you walk out of the porch of the Arlington House looking at the city, there's General Sheridan. If you look to your left, there's Admiral David Dixon Porter. So there are a couple people, two generals and one admiral, that requested burial like right out in front of the Arlington House. General Crook was buried there, and we also started seeing an officers section. They established two officer sections at Arlington at the time. They were segregated at the time. Officers had their own section. And really, depending on the size of your wallet, it could kind of dictate the size of your grave. So much so the Commission of Fine Arts a few decades later started to complain that Arlington was looking like a raucous and gaudy mess in the officers' quarters. That was their words, not mine. But in section 1, there's the grave of Lieutenant Thomas Hudson McKee. and General Benjamin Kelly. McKee was General Kelly's aide. And we have some urban legends at Arlington, and one of them is that Mrs. McKee didn't quite approve or like General Kelly. So supposedly she said the sun would never shine on General Kelly. She probably hired the same monument maker, and when you drive side and then you go in front, it looks like one grave. In 1898, we began to expand, and we've been expanding ever since. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, February 15th, 1898. It was the spark that started the Spanish-American War, and the rallying cry for war was "Remember the Maine." We ended up becoming a world power. We gained territories, and in 1899, the sailors and Marines that were recovered were brought back to Arlington Cemetery. In Cuba, the cemetery, the administrators were saying to the United States, pay for the graves or take them out. And so the United States opted for the first time to repatriate remains. And prior to that, unless your family was wealthy, you tended to be buried where you fell or buried at sea. But they carved out another section for the Spanish-American War, brought back these Marines and sailors. About less than a decade later, the Cuban government asked to please remove the remain from the harbor because it was an obstacle in the harbor. The United States Army Corps of Engineers went into action. They built a coffer-dam around the ship. They drained all of the water, and they recovered the remaining sailors and Marines. Part of my job is that when a dignitary, we have 3 historians of the cemetery, when a dignitary visits and they lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, we give them about a 10-minute history of Arlington. And one year, a general from the Middle East came. He watched the changing of the guard, and at the end he said, I'd really like to see the rest of the cemetery. So I took him around for about 2.5 hours, but our first stop was at the Mass of the Maine Memorial. And I told him that story, and through the interpreter, the general was scanning the section, seemed like an eternity, and he turned to me, the interpreter said, the general is very moved by that story. He said that the great lengths that the United States would go to recover service members and bring them back here home. He says, we don't do that. And so, throughout the year we get foreign dignitaries that lay wreaths, and that's just one of the stories. I ended up taking him to section 60, which is a more modern section where Iraq and Afghanistan casualties are buried in part of that section, and I took him to the grave of an American who had a Muslim emblem of belief on his headstone, and I told him about how this captain gave his life. And the general said, well, what's that on that headstone? And I said, it's a Buddhist emblem of belief. And he said, what's that one? And I said, well, it's a Methodist emblem of belief. What's that? And I said, well, there's the Star of David 10 feet away, and Latter-day Saints. And I was going down as everyone he asked me, and he just stood there for, it seemed like another eternity. And the interpreter turned to me and he said, the general's moved that all of these people fought for one common cause, and said, no matter what differences they had. And I kind of, yeah, good observation. We also started seeing officers from the American Revolution being brought from other cemeteries to Arlington. Also, unknowns from the War of 1812 were discovered at Fort McNair and buried at Arlington. So we have really service members from the American Revolution through today. Now, getting back to the Spanish-American War veterans, they started to put their own mark on the cemetery just as the Civil War veterans did. In 1902, the Colonial Dames dedicated the Spanish-American War Memorial, pictured here. They gave the cemetery a leather-bound book with handwritten names of all of the casualties from the war. In 1903, the old amphitheater was starting to look like kind of that old cemetery look, and the Civil War veterans started to say that they needed a better venue for Decoration Day. A world power really can't have its remembrance days in an old wood and brick amphitheater, and I'll get to that more later. In 1905, the Spanish-American War nurses dedicated the Spanish-American War Nurses Memorial. It was the first time that women gained eligibility to be buried at a national cemetery. Dr. Anita McGee who served during the Spanish-American War, lobbied Congress and the War Department. She said, look, women, I'm paraphrasing, but she basically said, look, these women served in uniform. They should be eligible for national cemeteries. And as a result, the eligibility was open to women who served. We also started seeing friends of notable veterans, such as Philip Kearny, who was a Civil War general who was killed, Kearny the Magnificent. He was buried in New York, and his friends erected an equestrian statue made of bronze and then disinterred him and reinterred him at Arlington. By the time he was reinterred, everyone in the country knew Arlington Cemetery. In 1915, the Mass of the Main Memorial was dedicated. It resembles a gun turret, and all of the casualties, their names are etched into that granite all the way around. 1919 was the last year that Memorial Day was, or the Decoration Day was held at the old amphitheater. World War I veterans started to show up to the Decoration Day activities and put their mark on the cemetery. You'll see here a Civil War veteran, Spanish-American War veteran, and a young World War I veteran. Civil War veterans and Spanish-American War veterans lobbied Congress for that memorial amphitheater, and this is a plan what the architect Carrere and Hastings had envisioned. This was from a time capsule that Woodrow Wilson placed in 1915, and I was able to open the time capsule in 2020. I'm old. In 2020, I was able to open the time capsule with our conservator. It took us a few hours to get through it, and then there was a second box inside, but everything looked like it was placed yesterday. And what I always point out is that the architect had envisioned an obelisk in one plan, and one of his earlier plans he envisioned a very large statue at the steps on the side of Washington, like you'd walk out and see Washington, D.C., so you'd see the statue in Washington, D.C. So he envisioned a large statue. They ran out of money, and so the statue was not there when we opened. The day that they opened, the Spanish-American, you could see the old Spanish-American War veterans, Indian War veterans, and other veterans. This was their day. This memorial amphitheater was to honor America's wars from the Revolution through the Civil War, through the Indian Wars, through the Spanish-American War. And there was nothing for World War I because, I mean, the building opened in 1920. And they had already carved all of the battles around the memorial. However, months after the dedication ceremony, the British and the French interred their unknown soldiers in London and in Paris. The American people read about these grand ceremonies, and they started to lobby Congress and say we should have one unknown American soldier here at Arlington to represent those who didn't return. As a result, Hamilton Fish, representative from New York, and a World War I veteran, put forth legislation to select, honor, and inter one unknown American to represent those who never returned. President Woodrow Wilson signed legislation as one of his last acts as president, and in October of 1921, 4 teams went out to 4 American military cemeteries in France. They each had 2 grave cards for unknown soldiers' graves. They were told to go to the first candidate. If you find any identifying marks, go to the second candidate. In all 4 cemeteries, the first candidate was unknown. They each had a specific casket on hand, and they were told, do not mark the casket in any way. They each placed their unknown in each casket. The 4 teams converged on the City Hall at Chalon-sur-Marne in France, where a final selection was made. Edward Younger here was given the honor of selecting. It was supposed to be an American general, but when the general was standing outside of the City Hall with the French general said, you know, our unknown was selected by our lowest ranking private. And so the American general turned to the colonel, who turned to the lieutenant colonel, who turned to the major, who all the way down. And then the captain went and talked to the enlisted men who were the pallbearers. And Edward Younger had a distinguished war record. He had been wounded twice, and so he was given the honor of selecting. There was a joint French and American honor guard that moved all 4 caskets around inside the City Hall. Before he went in, he walked in with a bouquet of white roses, circled the caskets a few times, and then He recounted later that he felt as if his hand was being guided to one of the soldiers. He said it could have been someone who took a bullet for me, and he just felt that that was the one. So he placed the white roses. That soldier became the unknown soldier, and the other three were then reinterred in France. In the meantime, the original contractor was called back to start construction of a tomb. They didn't have a lot of time, October to November 11th, so they started cutting up the front of the amphitheater to build a small tomb. The unknown was then brought across the Atlantic, docked at the Washington Navy Yard, and then brought to the U.S. Capitol, where 90,000 people paid their respects. And you'll see there's a statue, Auguste Saint-Gaudens's Statue of Victory. That was a gift from the President of China in 1921, and we have that on display today in the Memorial Amphitheater. It was then brought to the amphitheater where they had a funeral. General Pershing, the Chief of Chaplains, and others were there. This is a photograph of the Chief of Chaplains placing soil from France into the crypt. There's Chief Plentycou. He was a Crow chief. He left his war bonnet as a tribute, and we still have that war bonnet hanging in the amphitheater in a display. Here's two different photographs from before the tomb and then after the tomb. And for the World War I generation, I would say the tomb became the bridge to the future. As I said, the Memorial Amphitheater was really a revolution through Spanish-American War. The World War I tomb then made it almost a living memorial that as we progress in history, more unknowns followed. The tomb was a place where any family could go and say, this could be my loved one. This is a photograph that we found of, who knows if this was a wife or a friend, or we had, but any family could go and contemplate. The two examples that I give is that we have a leather-bound book with all of the wreath cards that were left at the funeral. I mean, if you see the whole front of the stage was just covered in wreaths. So I looked up Cecil Maxwell, and his name is on the Peace Cross in Bladensburg, Maryland. And I still get choked up when I tell the story. Like, his mother had no idea where he was buried or what happened to him. And she came over he was born in Lanham. She came over to Arlington the day of the funeral, and this could have been her son. The bottom example is a family who left a wreath in honor of their son and his shipmates. They were lost at sea. They had no grave to visit. So this unknown stood in for their son. The Gold Star mothers would make pilgrimages every year to Arlington. General Pershing was there many years. He led the American Expeditionary Forces in France. The Gold Star mothers would come every year. They still come out every year. Gold Star families. The original architect designed some display cases to display all of the gifts that were bestowed on the unknowns, including the Medal of Honor and the Victoria Cross. This is an image we found at the Library of Congress. You can see the Victory statue up on a pedestal and a civilian guard. It always surprises people that the tomb was not always guarded. For the early years, in 1922, letters started coming into the War Department requesting a guard at Arlington. They said that many of these people who had visited London, Paris, and Rome said that they saw armed sentries and that it would really add some dignity to the site if we had an armed soldier at Arlington. Believe it or not, the generals pushed back. Some of the letters some of the responses were that it would be an annoyance to the soldier to walk from Fort Myer to the Memorial Amphitheater. The soldiers would pass that annoyance on to other soldiers. One of them said, there's nowhere to quarter the soldiers, and another general said that we would never receive the thousands of visitors that they receive in London, Paris, and Rome. We now get over 3 million visitors a year. But one of the reasons why they wanted a guard there was because Washington newspapers were reporting that kids were playing around the tomb, and one of them quoted, they said, thoughtless, careless women are carrying on conversations in front of the tomb, and they need to be stopped. And so the Army put a little fence around it. Then they eventually put the civilian guard, And then in 1926, they put an Army guard during cemetery hours. And that kind of became the genesis of that tomb guard. But back then, it was only during the cemetery hours. Now, the original architect came back. He saw this as his opportunity to complete his master work. And so he mocked up, it's probably wooden canvas painted. He mocked up his statue, but on top of the statue, he had a sarcophagus. And he probably figured that would, was a good way of completing his grand masterpiece. And the Commission of Fine Arts absolutely loved it. They thought it was very tasteful. The Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy thought that it was horrible, and so they sent word that they didn't like the design at all. And so Hastings put forth other designs for a tomb of the unknown soldier. And finally, the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy basically said that really, no matter what he proposes, we don't think he can we don't think he can do anything that'll be fitting. So they had a design competition. There were over 75 artists and architects that submitted plans. And the winning design was by Lorimer Rich and Thomas Hudson Jones. Both of them were World War I veterans. And this was the winning sketch. You can see the Quartermaster General, Secretary of War, announcing it. Construction began, and it was unveiled to the public in 1932. The figures were carved in place: peace, victory, and valor. And I forgot that I have a photograph of all the quarry workers with the block, and many of them are wearing their American Legion hats. So they're World War I veterans. The first thing that somebody donated the photograph, and I love it when some new photograph shows up. But in this one, the first thing I saw, and I forgot to put it in here, the first one I saw was their American Legion hats. So they were making their comrade's tomb. So the unknown soldier lay at Arlington for many years, until he was joined by two others. In 1946, Congress passed legislation to select, honor, and inter a World War II unknown soldier. Plans were made to inter him in 1950, but the Korean War started. So it wasn't until 1958 that they had a double funeral. Similar to World War I, they sent teams out to multiple cemeteries. The top right is a selection ceremony for the transatlantic candidate. The top left is a Korean War unknown selection. The bottom is, the top left is the Trans-Pacific candidate for World War II. The bottom is the Korean War unknown selection. And then on the lower right, they brought the three of them off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, aboard USS Canberra. They took the two World War II candidates into a missile compartment, moved them around, and then placed them on either side of the Korean War unknown as a way to make sure that no one would know which theater of operations they came from. The burial records were burned, and William Charette, a Medal of Honor recipient, was given the honor of selecting. He was the only enlisted Navy Medal of Honor recipient to live, to receive the Medal of Honor during the Korean War. The two unknowns were then brought to the Capitol, then here to Arlington. President Eisenhower presided over the funeral. He presented the Medal of Honor to each of the unknowns. And what's interesting here is that President Eisenhower stood in as if he were the family of the World War II unknown. So you have President Eisenhower, who led the United States forces, who led the D-Day, is now the president, and he's accepting that flag as any family would today. We have up to 27 funerals a day at Arlington. Vice President Nixon is seen there, and he stood in as the next of kin of the Korean War unknown, and he accepted the flag as any family would. When I first started working for Arlington, I was chatting with one of the Medal of Honor recipients. That I used to interview Medal of Honor recipients, and he said, "Oh, I presented the flag to Vice President Nixon." So I said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And I brought him in, and I recorded him in front of the flag, and it's on our YouTube channel. It's about a 30-minute interview where he talks about the planning planning the funeral to that when he handed the flag to Vice President Nixon. The next major event in our history after the burial of the World War II and Korean War unknowns were President Kennedy's funeral. It was the first time that the American people saw the full honors funeral on television. And all of a sudden, burial requests quadrupled. It's so much so that Secretary of Defense McNamara said if we don't do something to rein in the eligibility requirements or to tighten up the eligibility requirements, the cemetery is going to be full by the end of the decade, meaning the 1960s. So they started to tweak to tighten up eligibility. You'd no longer see the veteran, the spouse, infant children all in a row. That's one of the things that we see in the newer sections where it's one family per plot. So you'll have you'll have the veteran and their next of kin all in one plot. But prior to Kennedy's funeral, it's not uncommon to see a family side by side. The Vietnam generation wanted to put their mark on the cemetery. And in 1978, there was no unknown soldier in 1978, and they didn't think that there would be one. So President Carter dedicated a plaque to the Vietnam veterans, and the plaque hangs in the Memorial Amphitheater display room if you ever want to visit. In 1983, they put a plaque out near the tomb that explained that there is still no unknown. But in 1984, one unknown soldier from Vietnam was designated. They didn't have a selection ceremony as in previous wars because the pool of unknown candidates was down to one. So he was designated by Alan Kellogg, a Medal of Honor recipient. He placed a wreath in Hawaii. He was brought back to Arlington, and President Reagan presided over the funeral. President Reagan accepted the flag, as any family would. After 1984, one family was petitioning that they should disinter the unknown soldier because they felt that that was where their brother, the unknown soldier was found where their brother went down. After a while, he was disinterred in 1998, and he was identified as Michael Blassie of the Air Force. Their mother was still alive, and so he was returned to his family, and he's now at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. In 1999, the empty crypt in the center was rededicated to honor America's missing personnel, and it remains empty to this day. So when I was at the train show, I had asked for a list of Kensington residents who are buried at Arlington, and they sent me a list of maybe 40 or 50 names, and it is difficult trying to track down military records, believe it or not, sometimes. But I found 3 who are buried at Arlington from that list. One of them is Colonel Clarence Sayer. He was elected mayor of Kensington multiple times, and the Historical Society sent me the Know Your Neighbors articles that were in the newspapers here. So Colonel Clarence V. Sayer was elected mayor of Kensington for the 3rd time at the town election held in the Armory, Monday, June 3rd, 1946. At that time, he was a resident of Kensington for 37 years. It says his untiring efforts for the betterment of the community earned for him the title of the town's first citizen. He was born in 1876. When he was a lad of 7 years, he moved to Washington, D.C. While his children were quite small, he determined to move where they would have plenty of space to grow up in. So many trips were made in the adjoining counties to find just the right place. After much deliberation, Kensington was selected for their future home, and in 1907 he purchased the property on what is now the corner of Garrett Park Road and Lincoln Avenue. It says that he served in the Spanish-American War, served in World War I. He was a member of the District of Columbia National Guard for 22 years and the Maryland State Guard for 16 years, and he is responsible for this armory, according to the newsletter. At the outbreak of World War II, he felt the responsibility to serve, so he went to work in the General Accounting Office, and he became mayor of Kensington. He was affiliated with the Methodist Church, according to the article. And progress has always been Colonel Sayer's watchword. It says his present project is working towards a paid, trained recreational leader and wife who will sponsor worthwhile activities which will keep the young people in Kensington, and of course a suitable building for such a project. Another one was Captain Frank Manson of the U.S. Navy. He was born in Oklahoma. It says, it talks about his high school studies, and it says, while deliberating current subjects, he began to get an insight into basic into basic and fundamental principles of government and was fired with the desire to enter the diplomatic service. With this in mind, he came to Washington and found that his 20 years would not qualify him for such a job. His 20-year-old. So he went to work for the State Department. In a few months, war was declared, and he was commissioned an ensign in the Navy. He served from 1942 to 1944, and he served aboard the USS Laffey. And that was one ship that, I mean, it was like, they call it the ship that wouldn't sink. It was hit by so many kamikazes and still made it back. And it's a museum now down in South Carolina. But he says, his first sea duty was aboard the USS Laffey, that famous destroyer which made history in the Philippines, the defense of Leyte Gulf, Ormac Bay, Mindoro. He was in strikes on Tokyo, and radar picket duty at Okinawa, and for his services he earned the Navy Commendation Medal. This is still in his very early 30s. He has a brilliant career ahead of him. This was 1954. He's completed a movie script on a Navy training film for the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, which required a vast amount of research. He also helped he authored a Navy history of Korea and 2 books on the naval history of World War II. It says he has an interest. He is as interesting a conversationalist as he is a writer. His patriotic standards are unusually high, and he puts into practice what most people call love of country. And then finally, David T. Weston. It says he was the owner of the second house to be erected on Pliers Mill Road in Oakland Terrace. He was a native of Center County, Pennsylvania. He attended the local schools and graduated from Phillipsburg High School. He had an opportunity to enter the post office service in 1936. And it says David Weston is a man with vision and imagination. Having a pretty good idea he would want a home of his own someday, he went lot hunting and selected a very nice wooded section on high ground above Kensington. Whether or not the purchase of the lots hastened the wedding is a matter of opinion. In 1940, announcements went out of his marriage to Miss Peggy Henson of North Dakota, a secretary to Congressman Usher Burdock of that state. The young couple designed their house with the entrance ideas belonging to the bride. They were celebrating its completion with a housewarming on Pearl Harbor Day in December of 1941. A year later, Weston enlisted and was called to duty the next September. He went to officer candidate school, and he was awarded a Silver Star, which is our nation's 3rd highest award for valor, in France. And it was for gallantry in actions from 8 to 20 January 1945, and it was in France. During this period, Lieutenant Weston served as an artillery forward observer with infantry units and demonstrated superior ability and combat efficiency by furnishing supported units with effective artillery support while working with Company B, 56 Armored Infantry Battalion. Lieutenant Weston assisted in repulsing an enemy counterattack supported by tanks. After demolitions failed to destroy the bridge across the Zorn River, crawled under intense mortar, tank, and small arms fire to a favorable position 250 yards from the bridge and 400 yards ahead of the most advanced infantry elements, from which he adjusted fire of an 8-inch howitzer and completed the destruction of the bridge. The French awarded him the Croix de Guerre, and he returned to the United States in 1945. It says that his hobby was refinishing furniture. So this is a photo I found at the University of North Texas Archives, and he's the second one from the right in the back. And you can see his wife is on the back of the headstone. And so at Arlington, if the spouse dies first, they go on the front, and then when the eligible veteran dies, the spouse's name will be on the back, and the veteran will be on the front with the wars that they served in and any awards.
They just turn it around?
No, because the back has a section number and a grave number etched on the top, so the contractors, they put in a brand new headstone. We also have, I forgot to mention, Medal of Honor headstones. So in 1976, the Veterans Administration wanted to honor Medal of Honor recipients, and they came up with a gold, it's like a gold emblazoned headstone with the Medal of Honor on the top. So we have over 410 Medal of Honor recipients at Arlington. And the letters are all in gold, and the Medal of Honor is in gold. And there are a few exceptions, but Audie Murphy, how many of you have heard of Audie Murphy? Okay, he's considered the most decorated soldier of World War II. He actually has a standard white government headstone with no embellishments. And the Army was practically pleading with his widow to change it out for the brand new special Medal of Honor headstone. And Mrs. Murphy wrote back and she said Audie was a humble soldier. He would not have wanted any embellishments on his headstone other than his list of awards, because he would have felt that they were all equal in death. And so, I mean, we have a letter from a congressman pleading with her, and she wouldn't have any of it. So if you ever visit Arlington, he's buried right near the Memorial Amphitheater. And that concludes the 106 years of history in about, what was that, 30 minutes?
So we'll take some questions, and what Tim might do is paraphrase the question into the mic so we can catch it for our recording, and if any questions are coming through Zoom, we'll bring those up too. So ask away.
I guess just a follow-up to that one, for the columbarium marble, are those just turned around?
No, they, so those will have the veteran and the spouse on the same one.
Yep. And
And there's not as much that you can put lines on there. So like with the headstones, you'll see some of them have terms of endearment. You know, the families want to, you know, maybe some of the families want to put there, or they'll have the awards. And then the columbariums, you'll sometimes see the, you know, the highest medal.
Sorry, I meant if the spouse dies first, then
Yeah.
the veteran.
Oh, yes, but I mean, yeah, they'll put the spouse first, but they don't turn it around.
Okay,
It's a brand new, yes. Yes.
Will they put flags this year?
Yes, so on Memorial Day, the Old Guard goes out and they place flags on every grave. They do it, it's pretty impressive to watch early in the morning, and it's finished within a matter of hours. Yes.
When did the Old Guard evolve into its current role?
So the question was, so the question was, when did the Old Guard evolve into its current role? The Old Guard took over responsibility for, well, they were stationed at Arlington in 1948, and in 1948 they took over responsibility for guarding the tomb. And then I forgot to mention that so in 1937 the Army went to a 24-hour guard, and then in 1948 that's when the Old Guard took over. And in 1958 they designed the Tomb Guard Identification Badge. It's one of the rarest badges in the Army. 735 soldiers have earned it to date. Yes.
Are they running out of space?
So we are running out of space, but we are trying to alleviate that. We just a couple years ago we opened the Millennium Project. That's between Fort Myer, if you're familiar with the area. So Fort Myer, there's Arlington Woods, and then the Arlington House. It opened up 27 acres and 27,000 burial spaces in ground and above ground. And now, if you drive down 395 past the Pentagon, you'll be able to see now we're expanding around the Air Force Memorial. And I haven't talked to the engineers yet to see it, but it's tens of thousands of spaces that'll be opened up in ground and above. Yes.
There's a facility for people who were cremated. Could you talk a bit about that?
So the question was, there's a facility for people who are cremated. So in the late 1970s, the Army started looking at columbarium courts. And in the early 80s, they started opening columbarium courts with niches for cremated remains as a way of expanding the life of the cemetery. They also, I mean, the Army Corps of Engineers sometimes I think can do anything. The boundary wall of Arlington on Route 110, from the outside looks like a stone boundary wall. On the inside, it's columbarium niches all the way down the wall. So, yeah, that'll extend it for a while. Yes.
Could you describe what are the requirements now to be able to be buried?
Okay. So the question is, what are the requirements to be buried at Arlington? So I always refer people, I always refer people to our website for like the more detailed explanation. So I'll just give you the abridged version. If you die or are killed on active duty, then you're eligible for in-ground burial. If you're receiving retirement pay, so you served your time in the military. If you're a Medal of Honor recipient, Distinguished Service Cross, Navy Cross, or Air Force Cross, that's second highest award for valor. Silver Star, the third highest award. Purple Heart, former prisoner of war, that's in-ground. But most honorably discharged veterans with at least 1 day of active duty service can be buried in the columbariums. I say buried, I mean inurned in the columbariums above ground. We also have a memorial sections throughout the cemetery where if people were lost at sea or their remains were not recovered, if they were eligible for in-ground burial, the families can request a cenotaph. And it looks just like, it's a white government marker, but it says in memory of. So like Joseph Kennedy, the Kennedy family requested a cenotaph because he was lost and never recovered on a mission during World War II. So a sergeant major once told me, Tim, I asked you the time and you told me how to build a watch. And then you told me the history of watchmaking. So I give long answers.
So is there significance to that beautiful tie you're wearing?
Oh, the tie that I'm wearing is my daughter's school, Brookwood, right across the street. So, yes, Joe.
So the etchings that appear on the headstones, are those uniform with ABMC cemeteries overseas and other cemeteries within the United States that are?
So the question is about the headstones at Arlington. Are they uniform with American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries overseas? And the answer is no. So overseas at the ABMC cemeteries around the world, you'll see the headstones are crosses or stars of David. Over here in the United States, in 1873, they adopted that standard white headstone. So the national cemeteries have that standard white headstone. And then over time, they've adopted emblems of belief. So the early ones might have a Star of David or a Christian cross, but they have multiple emblems of belief to choose from. So the headstones have even evolved, just as the cemetery has evolved.
Okay, well, that was fabulous. Thank you again for all of
Thank
I'm so glad we're capturing this on film because this is something people are going to want to see if they weren't able to see it live tonight. And we have people on Zoom. For you Zoom people, I'm sorry, but we couldn't catch your questions. Hope we answered them in some way or another. Just a couple of quick things to wrap up. I do want to say a special thank you to Catherine Wood for really nurturing this program and making the link between Arlington and our local vets and trying to illustrate what we are trying to do here and capturing our history and preserving our history and telling the story. So kudos to Catherine. Yeah. And you'll appreciate our great refreshments team back there when we break for a moment. A couple of upcoming save the date kinds of things. KHS members are accustomed to a fabulous holiday party. December 14th, Sunday, put it on your calendar. If you're not a KHS member, you should become one ASAP because you're going to want to come to this party. We've got a great venue for it. It's going to be lovely. So anxious to see everybody there. So next year, big time, 250th semi-sesquicentennial something or other celebration. And it's going to be celebrated in a lot of different ways. And the U.S. government kind of let the states loose to do it their way. We have a Maryland 250th Commission, which has been formed to coordinate and facilitate celebrations around the state. And what they've done is really kind of say, heck, let's celebrate our heritage. We're not celebrating things that only happened in 1776. So you don't need a Revolutionary War ancestor or their home to celebrate. It's celebrating our various kinds of history here in Maryland. So communities are coming up with their own version of how they want to tell their story of 250 years in the U.S. Montgomery history here in Montgomery County is kind of the point in the county connected to the Maryland Commission to do some things there, and they're facilitating a lot of programming, and you'll get a lot of that coming out. We'll make sure we distribute it through KHS, and you'll see it otherwise. The interesting thing is next year is also the 250th anniversary of Montgomery County. So taking those two things, as KHS was thinking about programming next year, we're looking at, we'll talk about the House and Garden Pilgrimage in a minute, but we're looking to celebrate our county history. So the theme of some of our speaker programs is going to pick up unique aspects of our county, bring in interesting speakers, and celebrate our county history throughout the year. We've got programming decisions made for the January, March, and May timeframes, so as soon as we can get those dates down, we'll give you a save the date. They're going to be some serious, some fun, some a little quirky, so we'll have a mix of things throughout the year for that. One of the aspects of celebrating the 250th for Kensington is going to be to showcase our town in the Maryland House and Garden Pilgrimage. For those of you who are reading the Town Journal, I hope you've read the articles and are a little bit up to date. We've got some materials in the back here. Carrie and I will kind of be over in that general area. You'll get all the scoop on this. The Maryland House and Garden Pilgrimage is an organization that for over 90 years has been showcasing historic properties throughout the state of Maryland. Once a year, every year, they conduct tours. Each county gets, if they wish, to have one location on the tour, and they feature a preservation project for which the money is raised and distributed at the end of the whole tour. So we're one of 7 tour destinations next year. Our project is our Noyes Children's Library and the Noyes Children's Library Foundation, because that is a preservation project that is almost underway in a serious way. It'll leverage that property for the future. So we're showcasing our Kensington history by inviting people in to see historic private home tours, our landmark buildings, and programs. We'll be bringing in representatives from preservation and historical organizations at the state and county level to share what they're doing in the preservation arena and what's going on in the county. So it's going to be a heck of a day. June 7th, Sunday, be there. And you can jump right on the bandwagon right now, today, in the back corner. Best price tickets between now and the end of January, $40. You can cash your check, if you carry a checkbook, and get one back there, or order online. Got all the scoop on this. The cool thing for Kensington residents is if you think you've seen it all, and you probably haven't, but that's okay, you can buy a ticket, and the ticket value will benefit Noyes Library, but you can use the ticket for another tour. So you can go, heck, to Talbot County and see their cool things while it raises money for Noyes. So we want to see everybody there. The great thing about this program is that town-wide, I'm looking at people in the room who've been involved in putting this together, and it's really going to benefit businesses, our dining community, just our cultural essence. We'll be showing off our town, and so we're really looking forward to that. And I think that's all I've got. Yeah. So thank you again, and he's agreed to join us for refreshments. We ply him with some wine or something, and we'll all enjoy having a talk. Thank you.